briefly. There's lots of people who want to come to this event tonight, so can I ask you all to squeeze on the end of your row, just so we can get as much people into the chamber as possible? Thank you.
Yep. Hello. 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 Okay, yeah, fine, that works. Thanks.
start speaking so that you can test it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Time 11, 12, 99, 75.35. You're okay?
Good evening, everyone. Hi, everyone. So thanks so much for coming down to the Union this evening. We all know who you are here to see. So Professor Yanis Varoufakis is a Greek economist, academic, and politician who served as the Greek Minister of Finance from January to July 2015 when he resigned. Varoufakis was a Syriza member of the Hellenic Parliament from January to September 2015, and in February 2016, he launched the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025 and subsequently backed a Remain vote in the UK's European Union membership referendum 2016. So he's here tonight to speak on Brexit in the shadow of capitalism's uncertain future. Can everyone please put their hands together for a warm round of applause for Yanis Varoufakis?
I'm going to take the floor. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's always an immense pleasure and a privilege to be here at the Union. Brexit, what else? Now, let's get one thing absolutely clear. My one message today is, if you want, an attempt to go against the grain. Rejoice. Stop whinging about the state of your nation. This is a remarkable moment for British democracy. You should be celebrating, because you see, there are two ways of being obnoxiously nationalistic. The first one I experienced in this town back in the 1980s, when I took up a minor appointment, and one of the fellows in one of the colleges welcomed me by saying, "How does it feel, my young lad, as a person of a Greek predicament, to have been inducted into polite society?" That's, obnoxious nationalism. The sense that the aristocracy used to have in this country, that, this was an exceptional country. Exceptionalism. Unfortunately, in the same country today, over the last 3 years, for reasons that you are utterly familiar with, there is a different kind, if you want, the inverted version of that exceptionalism. You all tend to lament that your country is exceptionally awful, that your democracy has failed, that your parliament, your institutions are in a state of disrepair. The two exceptionalisms are equivalent. Ditch both of them. Britain is not the best country in the world, and it is certainly not the worst country in the world. Indeed, what has been happening over the last 3 years is a demonstration that parliamentarianism and the rule of democratic process is alive and well in this country in a way which is not the case in the rest of Europe. And I'm saying this as a Remainer, as somebody who, even though no one can accuse of being a lackey of Brussels, Brussels was indeed exceptionally impressed and somehow undermined by the fact that in 2016 I was campaigning against Brexit in this country. Nevertheless, as someone who has fought with Brussels a lot more than Boris Johnson ever will, I campaigned for Remain. I stand in front of you as a committed Europeanist, and I'm saying to you that British democracy is in a much better state than German democracy, French democracy, Greek democracy, Portuguese democracy, Spanish democracy. And the reason is one that Leavers and Brexiteers always try to play up. And that is not a bad thing. The reason is that you have a sovereign parliament. It is not powerful, but it is sovereign. And there is a profound difference between the sovereignty of parliament from the power of the nation. You can have a small country which is powerless, and yet its parliament can be sovereign. And this is precious. Think of Iceland. Tiny pipsqueak of an island nation. But what is the difference between Ireland, Iceland, Spain, Greece, France? That the parliament in Iceland was sovereign in 2008 when the financial sector collapsed, and the parliament stood up to the bankers, to the International Monetary Fund, to the financial sector and said, you are being expropriated, you messed up, you went bankrupt, we are not going to bail you out. Yeah? Tiny little parliament of a tiny, tiny, tiny little state had the capacity to do that. So I suspect that what I'm trying to do is I'm trying firstly to infuse a little bit of enthusiasm in your deflated hearts about democracy in this country. And secondly, to try to build a bridge between Leavers and Remainers. Because both have good arguments, and both found their good arguments or narratives upon awful, destructively false numbers and statistics. Both the Leavers and the Remainers are trying to inspire you to support them using fraudulent economics and fraudulent statistics. And it is your duty to stop the chasm from developing. It is your duty, firstly, to stop that wave, that tsunami of pessimism about the state of British democracy, aid and abet the civil war-like atmosphere that is being cultivated by people who don't care very much about Brexit or about the EU, but who use this opportunity in order to pursue hidden agendas regarding their vision of Britain, or whether it's utopian or dystopian is a matter of debate. So let's start at the beginning, shall we? Winston Churchill. 1949, I believe, he gave a speech in Switzerland in which he said that it is absolutely essential that we create a United States of Europe. This has been quoted again and again and again. What has not been quoted as much was the next sentence, which was that Britain should not be in it. Because we are with Europe, he said, if I recall his words precisely, we are not of Europe. I mean, Churchill is certainly not one of my idols, but nevertheless, he caught an important dimension of the incongruity between the United Kingdom and the European Union. Capitalism sprang out in this country spontaneously. Nobody wanted it. The church didn't want it, the king didn't want it, the lords didn't want it, the barons didn't want it. Nobody actually planned it. That's why it was spontaneous. It emerged as a result of a combination of the international trade routes, the pirates that then turned into civil servants, the establishment of, by necessity, of Britain, of England at the time, as a maritime power, together with the enclosures. The enclosures created a working class that gave commercial value to the land, because suddenly the land could cultivate wool, well, actually could feed sheep that produced the wool. The wool was traded internationally by merchants stemming from Southampton and from other great ports in this country. So suddenly, the Lord could look at an acre of land and could know how much economic value it could produce in terms of wool, which was priced internationally. Suddenly, an acre of British land, of English, Welsh, Scottish land, acquired a price. For the first time in history, there was a price involved, a certain rate of return. So that was the beginning of capitalism. And indeed, most of the powers that be at the time in Britain were against capitalism. The royal family was undermined by it. Suddenly, there was a schism between political power and economic power. For the first time in the history of the world, political power was not identical to economic power. Once upon a time, if you were a lord, you were rich. And if you were rich, it must have been that because you were a lord. For the first time, you could be a dirty merchant that would not be allowed into the clubs in London, let alone the, Windsor Castle, and have more power, economic power, than the lords, or indeed the king. So that's how capitalism emerged in this country. How did it emerge in Germany? Kaiser decided that Germany must compete with England, and that the German state should introduce capitalism into Germany. It was a top-down state enterprise. If you look at the beginnings of the European Union, remember the first name of the European Union? The European Communities of Coal and Steel. What's this? It was a cartel. What was the point of it? Like OPEC. When OPEC was formed, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, what was the intention? To limit competition, to make sure that the producers and sellers of oil were not competing against each other, fix the price, agreed on a profit margin, distributed the profits amongst themselves, the economic rents, not even profits, economic rents. The amount of value that they were extracting from the world economy, that's exactly how the European Union began in 1950. So when Churchill was saying, folks, you need this to the continental Europeans, but we're not going to be part of it because we're not of this, he had a point. Historically, from the point of view of economic history, it was completely correct. But then, Suez took place, Britain was bankrupt, the United States was looking at British politicians talking about the special relationship and feeling pity for British politicians, because there was never such a thing as a special relation between the UK and the US. It was only a figment in the imagination of politicians in this country. So gradually you drifted into the European Common Market. The European Common Market evolved since then. If this was 1974, I would have voted against Britain entering the European Economic Community. Indeed, I voted, well, I was never given a vote because the Greeks were not given a vote to enter the European Economic Community. One day we woke up and we were in the European Economic Community. But had there been a referendum in Greece, I remember as a 15-year-old, I was demonstrating against entering the European Economic Community. So Tony Benn, who was one of my idols in this country when I moved to Britain in 1978, and also a mentor of Jeremy Corbyn, who is, I have to confess, this is full disclosure moment, Jeremy Corbyn is a great friend of mine. Jeremy and I have both been influenced massively by Tony Benn. Tony Benn was against the entry of Britain into the European Economic Community. I have no doubt that if Tony Benn lived today, he would have been on our side against Brexit. Because it is one thing to say you should not get in, and it is quite another to say you should get out. Because when you get out 43 years later, you don't end up where you would have been had you not entered. This is for any one of you that has ever touched mathematics. It's the difference between dynamic analysis and static analysis. They're not the same thing. And if you confuse the two, you are in serious trouble. So Having said that, while watching and participating the debates in 2016 during the referendum, I was appalled by the fact that my side was formally represented by people like Tony Blair, David Cameron. My goodness, right? Every time they opened their mouth, I thought, okay, we're going to lose now. Brexit will win. Every time David Cameron supported Remain, I thought, that's it. Brexit will win. And who were the other figures that supported Remain? Christine Lagarde from the International Monetary Fund. Wolfgang Schäuble from Berlin was saying to you, if you vote to get out of the European Union, you will suffer. It's like saying to the Brits, vote to get out. You know, I mean, he had never watched Fawlty Towers. Never. If you haven't watched Fawlty Towers, you make a mistake of supporting Brexit by opposing it from Berlin. There was one important argument in favor of Brexit that Remainers never, ever addressed. And that is, I'm going back to an earlier theme, the theme of sovereignty of Parliament. You've read articles in the Financial Times, in The Guardian, The Observer, and so on, and the argument is, in the era of globalization, we're too small a nation to talk about sovereignty. Nobody's sovereign. Again, they are conflating and confusing sovereignty with power. The Brexiteers had a good Burkean, that's Edmund Burke, point about the importance of maintaining the sovereignty of our parliamentary process. As a Europeanist, that for me means that we should have a European Parliament that is sovereign. The tragedy of the European Union, and my criticism of the European Union, is we don't have a sovereign parliament. We have a European Union Parliament, which is not a parliament. It's a parliament only in name. So when Nigel Farage stands in it and lambasts the institution that is paying his salary, he's right. But he's wrong to suggest that the solution to this is to get out. Because once you're in, I remember I was here in 2015 and I came up with, I think it was in this chamber, with the term Hotel California, for those of you who remember the song. And the last verse you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. Once you've been enmeshed in the European Union for 43 years, all you do by getting out is you're creating, you're causing a lot of harm upon the people who are sick and tired of the lack of democracy. So the very same narrative that appeals to people's democratic instinct and to the sovereignty of Parliament is implementing a Brexit that is going to damage the life prospects of those very same people. And I very much doubt that the result of Brexit is going to be the return of sovereignty to the British Parliament. Look at the British Parliament. Theresa May, well, there was a plethora of errors on her part, but one of them was to essentially not violate, but annul the sovereignty of British Parliament in the process of getting Britain out of the European Union in order supposedly to restore the sovereignty of Parliament. But let me now address the future, because historical analysis is only worth it if it helps us pave the ground for a decent, promising, hopeful future. You have an election coming up on the 12th of December. I think that is a very, very good thing, because this election is going to give you, the voters in this country, an opportunity for clarity. The systemic press is denigrating both Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn. But I must say that these two men, whether you like them or not, this is not a matter of personal preference, they represent two clear choices. And indeed, they represent the only clear choices that there are. Boris Johnson is totally right to say that if you want to remove Britain from the European Union and to strike trade deals with the United States, China, other countries, you need to keep hard Brexit on the table. Because let's face it, you never enter a negotiation unless you are prepared to envision a situation where you walk out of the negotiation and you say no to the other side. That means you've got to be ready to break off relationships with the party with which you are negotiating if this is going to be a negotiation and not a complete surrender. So Boris Johnson is completely right on that. Where he's completely wrong is that hard Brexit would be preferable to remaining closely linked and aligned to the European Union. But that's my opinion. That's not his opinion. I respect his opinion. And I think that it is a very respectable opinion that we should treat with respect while disagreeing with it if you choose to disagree with it. At the same time, my side of politics, I mentioned my relationship with Jeremy Corbyn, who's been lambasted over 3 years now for dithering, for not being clear. It's not that he's not clear. Remember, before, well, you're too young to remember, but let me tell you, or remind you if you have some kind of memory of the fact. It was a few weeks before the referendum in 2016, when Jeremy was on a television panel, and one of those typical BBC journalists said, Mr. Corbyn, you are claiming to be in favor of Remain, but on a scale from 0 to 10, how enthusiastic are you about the European Union? Jeremy dithered a bit, I have to admit, and he said, 6? I would have said 2. 2. But think about it. Had the question been, I'm a Greek politician, right? And a Greek patriot, I believe. At least that's what I think. If you were to ask me, how enthusiastic are you about the Greek state on a scale from 0 to 10? I would say 1. Patriots have a duty to oppose their government when we think that our government is inflicting harm upon the many, upon the nation. That does not mean that we want to dissolve our state. It does not mean we are against our government as a concept. It means we are against this government. And it means that we are perfectly capable of saying, as a Greek citizen, that the Greek state sucks. Excuse my French. But it does. I can't think of a better expression. The Greek state is corrupt, it's inefficient, it destroys the soul of the civil servants, it is often open to abuse. And as a patriot, I want to change that. I'm not going to say that I'm out of 0, a scale from 0 to 10, I'll give it 9 because I'm a patriot. Then I would be an anti-patriot if I thought that my state is not up to scratch. Similarly, as a Europeanist, I give Europe, official Europe, Brussels, on a scale from 0 to 10, I give it 2. A bit more, double than what I give the Greek state. But that doesn't mean I want to dissolve the European Union and to get out of the European Union. Because, we have institutions in the European Union like the European Investment Bank, right, which is 4 times the size of the World Bank, and its capacity to fund the Green New Deal that this continent needs, whether you're in the EU or out of the EU. If we didn't have the European Investment Bank, we should invent it. So why would I want to get out of of an institution like that, like Boris wants? So the 12th of December gives you a very clear choice between 2 visions. The vision of Boris Johnson, which is a version of Thatcherism with Singaporean elements, and I'll explain in a minute what I mean by that, with a narrative of reversing austerity, right? You've heard that austerity is finished. Now the Tory party has become the most profligate party of government in the history of the United Kingdom. If you look at what they are promising in terms of expenditure, if the Labour Party had promised that in the previous years, they would have been laughed out of court. So this is the combination. Okay, first, trade deal with the United States, which has nothing to do with tariffs. You have to remember that. Trade deals are unrelated to trade. Because let's face it, tariffs are very low these days. So even if you eliminate them, there will be no appreciable difference in trade because of the elimination of tariffs. The key to free trade agreements, like TPP, TTIP, and so on, is the regulatory environment. It is the fact that the British government and the British Parliament would no longer be sovereign because a multinational with its base in Delaware, in the great state of Delaware, is going to have the right to sue the British state when it comes to some contract, to some regulation regarding food safety. They will have the right to sue the British state and to bypass the British Parliament in an independent private tribunal whose judges or advocates will be appointed by the multinationals. That is what is at stake. So what Boris is saying is that moving in that direction is going to open up Britain to investment by multinationals, similar to Ireland, forgetting that Ireland only attracted multinationals because it is part of the single market, and it combines low tax rates with being a member of the single market, while at the same time boosting expenditure in order to buy the votes of Labour leavers that are essential to Boris being elected on the 12th of the 12th. Yeah? You know what this is a recipe for? The Boris recipe? It's a recipe for increasing the dependence of, of your fates upon strangers, upon the kindness of strangers. You are already running a current account deficit of 6% of GDP. You already depend on inflows of capital that come into this country and are buying you out. You are already depending on the model of low productivity, low wages, low regulation, zero-hour contracts, cheap labor. Do you want more of that? Because this country will never be Singapore. Because Singapore combines liberalization and libertarianism with a geographical proximity to China. Effectively, it's a gateway to China. You will never be the gateway to China unless this country develops sails and you sail away from these beautiful waters and you approach Taiwan or Hong Kong. If you want to do that, consider it as a project. My friend Jeremy, on the other hand, and I'm being blatant about that, what is he proposing? He's proposing two things. First, to take the sting of a hard Brexit out of British politics, to give people a choice between two options, neither of which are toxic. One is to stay in the EU, and the other is to stay in the customs union and the single market. I'm very pleased that after many years and months of trying to convince the Labour Party, some of us had an impact in the announcement that took place yesterday that freedom of movement will be preserved. So, two non-toxic outcomes. You won't notice the difference whether one or the other gets voted in a referendum by the Labour Party. By the way, I'm not going to mention the Lib Dems because they're irrelevant. Come on, folks. They are proposing to revoke Article 50 by an act of Parliament. If you really want to poison British democracy forever, you know, try to usurp a referendum without another referendum and see what you get. And in any case, they're only doing this because they know they will not be elected. So any politician who makes promises on the assumption that they will not be elected do not deserve to be discussed in this great chamber. I shall conclude the way I started. Stop whinging. Celebrate the fact that this country, whether you're with one foot outside the EU or not, has a prospect of becoming a leader in green transition, in green investments. Already you're doing pretty well relative to the rest of the European Union in terms of renewables. This is the country that has managed this year to surpass 50% of energy produced by renewables. You have a great deal of scope in doing this. Let's have a discussion about the role that the City of London should play. Let's have a discussion about the new constitution of this country that you need to write down, because an unwritten constitution doesn't work. You can see that. You need to discuss the possibility of turning this country into a genuine federation in order to stop the centrifugal forces that are pulling it apart. You need to discuss the possibility of English assemblies, maybe one English parliament to complement the Scottish parliament. There is so much that the people of this country can do in order to take advantage of this democratic tsunami that is emerging out of the Brexit debate. The financiers have taught us in 2008 that it's always a good idea never to let a good crisis go to waste. They didn't let it go to waste, they made you pay for them. Why don't we use Brexit as a fantastic opportunity to reinvigorate British democracy and make British democracy once again a beacon of hope for us Europeans, the rest of us on the continent of Europe, who keep treating parliaments with contempt. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yanis, for your speech, obviously on a very hot topic right now, as you said last night. And thank you also for taking such a decisive stance on all of the issues you talked about. I think a lot of politicians come here and say everything and nothing at once. Okay, so we're going to start off with a bit of moderated Q&A. And I'd like to sort of begin by talking about a topic which you touched on in your speech and which we also talked about a bit when we were discussing potential topics for you to talk about here. And that's the Green New Deal.
Mm-hmm.
So you've discussed it a lot, obviously, as part of DiEM25. And I think with Extinction Rebellion and increasingly a lot of climate activism happening in Cambridge and also throughout the world, we can see, or well, I would argue that it's sort of climate activism is gaining momentum. But do you think the idea of a European Green New Deal specifically is gaining momentum? And whichever way you swing, why?
Well, you know why, better than I do. I'm pushing 60. You youngsters know that you're facing a future that is quite dystopian. And I am immensely energized when I look at what happens every Friday in Sweden, in Germany, in this country, with young children straight out of school striking for climate politics, climate-friendly politics. The problem with demonstrations is that they are half the story. The other half is, what do you say when a BBC journalist shoves a microphone in the face of a 15-year-old and says, okay, so what do you think should happen? Okay, you don't like what's going on. You want you want politicians and the adults who are behaving like children, that's why the children have to behave like adults, to do something about it. So what should we do? Then you need a plan. This is where the Green New Deal comes in. Allow me to say that because our generation has failed so spectacularly, and now we are probably very close or beyond the point of no return for climate catastrophe, we need urgent action. The politicians have a tendency to adopt the terms in order to deny the substance. Look at the European Union. They appointed Mr. Franz Timmermans as the commissioner in charge of the Green New Deal. Now the European Union has a Green New Deal, but there's no money involved in that. And they put Mr. Timmermans in charge. And Mr. Timmermans is the Archbishop of austerity. He was the one who invented austerity as a response to the financial crisis of 2008. So, of course, there will be no money for it. That's why we must prevent, or you must prevent, the youngsters, you must prevent the usurpation of your slogans in order to deny the substance of your demands. You must demand for your generation and the next generation a minimum of 5% of total incomes, of GDP if you want, to be spent in electrification and in the green transition. Minimum. Should be at 8% worldwide. If you look at the political parties, except Labour recently, you'll see that their costing is no more than 0.4, 0.5% of GDP. In other words, too little, too late, too irrelevant, too offensive. So the big question is, where is the money coming from for the Green New Deal? And I think the answer is public finance. That does not mean governments taxing you. But you've got to realize that there's a fantastic opportunity at the moment. Because if you look at the City of London, as we speak, in the City of London, there is £1 trillion, maybe 0.9 trillion pounds, 900 billion pounds, which is doing nothing. It's money which is slushing around in the financial accounts of the city, doing damage because by moving around, going around and around and around, paper pushing, it bids up share prices and house prices in the south of England. But that's not investment, right? That's simply price asset inflation. And no one is motivated enough, is optimistic enough to take this money, no merchant banker, no large corporation, and put it into, to press it into the uses that we need, like creating good quality jobs in the green energy sector, for instance, right? So what you need is a kind of sponge, a public sponge, something like a public investment bank that issues bonds. The bonds soak up this liquidity, and then the money is being used on banking principles, on the principle that investment must return a certain degree of profit, 2%, 3%, 4%, that's legitimate, while building up electrification. You know, the Chinese are doing it. In the last year, I mentioned that yesterday in this room, in the last year only, China has produced from new sources of renewable energy electricity equaling the total kilowatts produced by France and Germany. That's a huge amount of additional electricity from new renewables in one country. Why? Because they have a plan. In Europe, we don't have a plan. In Europe, we have anything but a plan. So this is what the Extinction Rebellion people, youngsters, you Cambridge students, you should be pushing towards. Pushing into the service, pressing into the service of the next generation, liquidity which is there. We're not talking about taxation. We're talking about, and this was the original New Deal. That's why the New Deal has to be revived in spirit. Roosevelt, in the midst of the Great Depression, noticed that there was excess liquidity, because the rich always have money. It's just that during the Depression, during a deflationary period, they're too scared to invest it because they think that the hoi polloi, the riffraff out there, won't be able to afford the goods and services that will be produced if they invest. So they don't invest. So the money accumulates. And what did Roosevelt do? He used US Treasury bills, equivalent bonds, in order to soak up that liquidity and create work programs. And the reason why the United States in 1932, 1933, 1934 did not follow Europe down the road to fascism and, you know, militant xenophobia is precisely that. We should put this to use regarding this generation's needs.
Yeah, and I think definitely the Green New Deal is such a sort of cross-generational thing, I think, at this point. Like you're saying, stressing the participation of the youth, but also, I mean, having figures like you heading it up and speaking about it is so important.
Well, actually, figures like you folks. Because, you know, we are a failed generation. We are now living our last days, and we have a chance to empower you to take over. You should not be giving us a vote of confidence. We have to give you a vote of confidence so that you take over. We're gone. We're finished.
Positive. Okay, my last question of the moderator's part, because I know that everyone will want to ask questions, is about sort of your career in politics, obviously. In the sense that you have been involved in economics and politics, I think both as an academic and also as the Greek Minister of Finance, for example. And I think that brings you sort of breadth of experience. And obviously, as the Greek Minister of Finance, you had to negotiate with the Troika. So my question for you is, how do you think the experience of negotiation sort of colored your political perspectives and your sort of academic perspectives moving forward from that?
We could have this conversation for many hours, but allow me to be very succinct. Firstly, when I was in those rooms with some of the most powerful politicians and bureaucrats in the world, I reminisced the days of the academy. Because in a university setting, the beauty of it is that as an academic, as a student, what you do is you put forward hypotheses in a tutorial, in a seminar context, and the job of your tutor, of your fellow students, of your fellow academics, is to take it apart, to take it to pieces, to disprove your hypothesis. Because this is what we do to one another. This is how knowledge progresses, by withstanding the test of your colleagues' friendly assault. Right? And what you need to have is an openness to the criticism of others, and a readiness to change your mind. If you don't have that openness and that readiness, you're a useless academic. You're a useless scholar. But just for a moment, imagine that you move from, like I did, from this setting to, let's say, a television panel, BBC Question Time. And let's say that during BBC Question Time, which I had the privilege to be part of a number of times, one of your co-panelists comes up with a very powerful argument, and suddenly you think, gosh, they're right, I'm wrong. If you're representing the Conservative Party, or the Labour Party, or the Lib Dems, whoever, and you say this on air, you're fired. Immediately, gone. So effectively, politics is predicated upon a closed mind. So this is the first response. What was I thinking of when I was in there? I was thinking, my best arguments really cannot do anything to shift these people. Because if they do get shifted by my arguments, they will lose their job. And that is a very asphyxiating feeling to have. And the second one was, I was impressed by the mediocrity of the technocrats. Because that was the one thing, people say to me, what is it that you found unexpected? I expected that when I would move into a discussion with the top technocrat of the International Monetary Fund, whose job was to discuss with me debt restructuring, VAT, technical things. I was expecting to encounter paragons of technical prowess. If they were my students, I would have failed them in the first semester of the first year.
Well, we'll move from that to the audience Q&A. Thank you. That point about closed minds is actually really interesting. I've never thought about it like that at all. But yes, everyone in the audience definitely has a lot of questions to ask you. So I'm going to open to audience questions. The order that I'm taking people, it's women first, then men. So who wants to start? We'll start with the front.
You need a microphone.
Good evening. It's an honor to be here because I've thoroughly enjoyed your book, Telling My Daughter About Economy. So I really wish to ask, what made you to switch your focus from studying economics as an economist to politics, and would you give the same advice to your daughter? Thank you.
Well, firstly, I would never advise my daughter to do anything, because if I did advise her to do something which I thought she should do, she would never do it. Right? It's a guarantee. Secondly, why did I go into politics? Because of the intense suffering of people around us. I never intended to go into politics. I was 50-something. It had never occurred to me. It was to allow me to cut to the chase. The bankruptcy of the Greek state, the Greek banks, the Greek families, and companies. And in the middle of this bankruptcy, looking at the oligarchy trying to remain staunchly in authority by pushing new debts upon the indebted, and using those debts for the oligarchy to reproduce its authority. And I thought, okay, now being closed up in the wonderful rooms of a university and indulging my theoretical impulses would be immoral to continue.
Okay, should we have the next question from the back there? Please wait for a mic before you start speaking.
We have the yellow vests in Cambridge. The gilets jaunes have moved from France.
Hi, thank you very much. I just want to ask, is Bernie Sanders still your preferred candidate in the current presidential race in the US?
Can you
Is Bernie Sanders still your preferred candidate in the US presidential race?
Yes, he is. He's a bit old. Well, let's keep this amongst ourselves. But he's still the person that combines sincerity, clear vision and analysis, and the capacity to speak to the heart of the dispossessed in the Midwest. Elizabeth Warren is somebody I appreciate very much. I don't think she has the capacity to speak to people between the two coasts. And therefore, I think that she would lose to Donald Trump, and that would be a disaster. I hope I'm wrong. As I said, I have the deepest respect for her. And let's face it, it was Bernie Sanders that opened up the road for all these wonderful women in the Democratic Party to rise up, from Elizabeth Warren, because Elizabeth Warren would not be a serious candidate now had Bernie Sanders not, 4 years ago, broken the mold of the Clintonite, conservative, pro-Wall Street Democratic Party. I will be very happy if Elizabeth Warren gets up and wins. But I have to say, to your question, at this point in time, Bernie still has my vote.
Okay. Shall we have that in the front row?
You've said many times, and you said it in your speech now, that deflation breeds monsters. And when you were talking about how the US didn't follow the path of Europe in the 30s, that was part of the reason, that they didn't employ these kind of deflationary economics. And I remember very vividly in your book, The Weak Suffer What They Must, you made that point in the German finance ministry of former Nazi building, and they didn't even get it then, right? So I just wonder what you think can be done to connect in people's minds between neoliberalism and austerity and the economic consequences, and then the very real political consequences that follow from that.
Look, the only way of getting to people that do not want to listen is by appealing to their self-interest. You know, remember Adam Smith saying in The Wealth of Nations that we never address others, or should never address others, by referring them to the common interest, the common will, our needs. We must always speak to them about what's good for them and try to connect what's good for them with what's good for the many. So in Germany, for instance, because I do a lot of political work in Germany since 2015, 2016, what works is to ask people who have been voting for Angela Merkel and the Christian Democrats and who are no longer supporting them and now have shifted to the right, to the quasi-fascist Alternative für Deutschland, to say to them, you see, I believe that you should never treat disrespectfully those that you disagree with, even if they are turning towards fascism. Because they are not fascists, they are victims of fascism, if they've become lured by it. And ask them, why are you no longer supporting Angela Merkel? Tell me, why? Why are you turning again? Why do you hate the European Central Bank? And the answer, of course, is that they have worked very hard in their lives. They put, 10, 20, 30,000 euros in the bank. And now they're suffering negative interest rates. And then to say after that, okay, now why do you think interest rates are negative? They say, oh, because it's Mario Draghi, that Italian, who is pushing down interest rates in order to keep buying Italian bonds to save his compatriots who should be ditched, that kind of thing. Then you say, hang on a sec. But in your country, you've got a mountain of money which is not being invested, and the lowest level of investment relative to the liquidity available. Now, you believe in demand and supply, don't you? You know that if the supply of shoes is huge and the demand of shoes is low, the price of shoes is going to fall, right? Because they're all liberal, they say yes. So when the demand for money is very low, that's investment funding, and the supply of money is huge, what do you think is going to happen to the price of money, which is the interest rate? It's going to fall. But unlike the price of shoes, which when it falls, it equilibrates supply and demand, when the interest rate goes down, it doesn't, because investors freak out. They think, oh, if the interest rate has become negative, it means things are terrible, so they invest even less. So this is the reason, right? So the problem is very low investment. Now the market has not, so you engage them. It's very tough, very difficult. You will probably end up with egg on your face. But, democracy was never meant to be an easy game. And the act of the process of persuading is both intensely tiring and highly satisfying on the one occasion in every 10 or 20 when you succeed in getting through to people. But you will only get through to them if you don't do a Hillary Clinton, which is to call them deplorables because they are voting for people that are deplorable.
Should we go for at the back there?
there. Thank you for your talk, Mr. Varoufakis. Just parking the issue of Brexit to one side for a minute, you mentioned some criticisms of Boris's domestic policies.
Can you speak up a bit?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
You mentioned some criticisms of Boris's domestic spending policies, for example, not dealing with Brexit right now. I'm wondering if we can now turn the scrutiny onto your friend Jeremy Corbyn, if that's possible impartially. And I was wondering what you think of his domestic economic policies and whether they could be sensible in any way or practicable.
Well, firstly, the economic policy belongs to another friend of mine, John McDonnell. And I think that John has done a remarkable job in putting together a team over the last 3 years that has forged an economic policy manifesto that is highly sophisticated. Initially, John McDonnell was lumped together with, the loony left. But even the Financial Times, in the last 6 months, every time they refer to John McDonnell and the economic policy that he's come up with, they do so with huge respect. If you look at the public finance that he's proposing, if you look at the National Investment Bank that he's proposing, I speak to bankers in the City of London, and most of them say to me, yeah, well, I don't like John McDonnell, he's a Marxist, so-and-so, but the proposal is good. We need it in this country. So in terms of the economic policy, if you look at what he's effectively saying, that you need to spend something between 200 billion and 300 billion over the next 2 years on the green transition. You need to spend that. Now, of course, if you lump 200, 300 billion onto the taxpayer, you've destroyed the taxpayer. And you will never be able to get this money by taxing the rich, because the rich are very adept at not being taxed. They will find a way of getting out. They're already out. But he's not talking about using taxation on its own. A tiny fraction of that will come through taxes. Most of it will come through public bonds. And people will say, but hang on a second, if you issue all these bonds, effectively you're bidding up interest rates and you're going to cause inflation, blah. Not when you have 900 billion of idle cash in the City of London. So I think, and also another dimension which I find very interesting is this idea of taking 10% of shares of large companies and putting it into a social welfare fund, a social wealth fund. Slight disagreement I have with both Jeremy and John on this is that they want the shares of a large British company, the 10%, to go into a fund that belongs to those the employees. So the employees share the dividends. I think that that fund should belong to the whole of society, and the dividends should be dispersed not just amongst the insiders, the trade unionists, the employees, but also amongst care workers, people living on the street, and so on and so forth. Because let's face it, most capital today is socially produced. It's no longer privately produced. If you think about Google, every time you search on a Google engine, you add to the capital of Google, but you're not getting any of the profits of Google, right? Any of the dividends. So increasingly, as capital is socially manufactured, society should get more and more shares, giving it property rights over the returns to that capital. You asked me, however, to be critical of Jeremy, and I'll make one criticism. He knows that. I've said this to him. What this country needed from the leader of the opposition a year ago, 6 months ago, when the dog's Brexit was wearing you folks down, emotionally and psychologically, what he should have delivered is a speech of hope for Britain, in which he would outline a vision for where Britain should be in the next 10 years, its relationship with Europe, a labour agenda for Europe, independently of Brexit. Because I keep saying that whether you stay in the EU or leave the EU, you will be an important part and parcel of the European Union. So Labour should have a labour agenda for Europe. And that speech had, speeches are important occasionally when they signal a major discontinuity in the historical trajectory. I would have wanted him to go out there to be more of a leader than a responder of developments in this dog's Brexit.
Okay, so I think we have time for one last question. So, how are we gonna... Okay, shall we go for there?
Hi. At the business school, we're teaching a course in financial technology to regulators from central banks and securities organizations in 30 different countries. And I read in your book a really interesting phrase, which was that you don't think there's a single person who fully understands the financial sector. So given that sort of limited capacity for people to understand all of the moving parts, what would your message be for the regulators?
That they need to be radical. Tampering around the edges of the financial sector is simply never going to work, because the financiers are always going to have better technologists, better lawyers, and better accountants than the central bank ever will. That's why we need, I think as a society, to reconsider the whole way in which private money is being minted. Because we all know, don't we, by now, I hope we do, that 96% of money is generated by the financial sector, not by central banks. So you need to take control, well, we need as a society to take control of money making. And one way of doing this, for instance, would be, rather than having those capital ratios where the denominator is manipulated by models that the financiers create, and therefore they can do anything they want in the end. If you can manipulate the denominator of a ratio, you can make the ratio have any value you want, right? So kick this out and I would impose an 18% equity ratio upon every bank. They would kick and scream, and they would say that this is going to eat into their capacity to produce loans to the private sector. Rubbish. All it will do is it will eat into their capacity to produce magnificent profits for them during the upturn and huge losses during the downturn that then are being passed on to the taxpayer. So be radical is my answer.
Okay, so thank you so much, Yanis, obviously, for coming to Cambridge and for sharing your thoughts with us two nights in a row. I'm just going to have a couple of notices before we leave. Firstly, can everyone please stay in their seats just as we leave? It will take, obviously, like 30 seconds, but it's just to avoid a lot of crowding at the chamber door. In terms of events that we have coming up, so our Bridgemas party tickets are now, as of 7 o'clock, on sale, and at 7, so now, we are also having a meet and greet with committee. Lastly, those of you who received an email from me for a meet and greet with Yanis, please come up to the stairs upstairs. I can guess which meet and greet people want to go to more. So, thank you so much again. Can we please have another warm round of applause?